Before we begin, if you enjoy relaxing, informative videos like this, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us grow and reach more curious minds like yours. And while you're here, drop a comment letting us know where you're listening from and what time it is there. We love hearing from our global community. Now, let's begin. The story of opium is one of paradox, both a healer and a destroyer, a symbol of both enlightenment and enslavement. Its influence stretches across centuries, continents, and empires. To understand how opium changed the world is to explore a complex web of culture, medicine, trade, war, and addiction. In this journey, we'll examine opium's ancient origins, its transition from sacred medicine to global commodity, and how it shaped the modern geopolitical map. Opium is derived from the latex of the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, a plant whose name means the sleep-bringing poppy. It's among the oldest known medicinal plants. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans have been cultivating it since at least 3400 BCE. The ancient Sumerians, living in what is now Iraq, referred to it as the joy plant. From them, its use spread to the Akkadians, the Assyrians, and eventually to the Egyptians. The Egyptians incorporated opium into their pharmacopoeia, combining it with other ingredients in remedies for pain, insomnia, and even as a treatment for crying infants. The Greek physician Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, recognized its pain-relieving qualities, but also warned of its dangerous effects. This early tension between opium's benefits and its dangers would be a recurring theme throughout history. By the time of the Roman Empire, opium was widely used across the Mediterranean. Physicians like Galen wrote extensively about its applications. It was often mixed into wine and given as an anesthetic. The famous Mithridate, a complex antidote to poisons, is said to have contained opium among its dozens of ingredients. With the fall of Rome and the rise of Islamic empires, opium's medical use flourished anew. Arab physicians preserved and expanded upon classical knowledge, refining extraction methods and using opium to treat a wide variety of ailments. Avicenna, the Persian polymath, included it in his Canon of Medicine, one of the most influential medical texts of the medieval period. As trade routes opened between East and West, opium traveled with caravans across the Silk Road. It reached India and China, where it was adopted into traditional medical systems. In China, opium was used in moderation, usually mixed with other herbs and administered in small doses. But the story began to take a darker turn during the 15th and 16th centuries, as global maritime trade expanded. European colonial powers, particularly the Portuguese and the Dutch, began transporting opium across the oceans. They introduced it to new markets, and it was during this time that recreational use began to rise. By the 17th century, British interest in opium grew. The British East India Company discovered that opium cultivated in Bengal could be highly profitable. The company began to export Indian opium to China, where demand was increasing rapidly. not for medical use, but for smoking, a practice that spread quickly and led to widespread addiction. This marked a significant shift. What had once been a medicinal substance revered for its healing powers was now being cultivated and sold on a massive scale for profit. And in China, this would have devastating consequences. As the Chinese population became increasingly addicted to opium, the Qing dynasty attempted to curtail its importation and use. In 1729, the first official prohibition on opium smoking was enacted, but demand was insatiable, and the trade continued through illicit channels, often with the tacit support of foreign merchants. The situation reached a crisis point in the early 19th century. British merchants, eager to balance trade deficits caused by their massive imports of Chinese tea, aggressively pushed opium into the Chinese market. Chinese officials, alarmed by the growing addiction problem and the social decay it caused, took bold steps to end the trade. In 1839, Commissioner Lin Zexu famously confiscated and destroyed large quantities of opium in Canton, now Guangzhou, sparking outrage in Britain. The British government, citing the destruction of private property and the need to protect commercial interests, launched a military response. Thus began the First Opium War. The First Opium War, fought from 1839 to 1842, was not merely a trade dispute. It was a confrontation between two vastly different worldviews, an imperial power built on commerce and expansion, and a traditional empire struggling to protect its people and sovereignty. Britain's military response to the crackdown on opium was swift and overpowering. The Royal Navy, technologically superior to the Qing fleet, launched an offensive against key Chinese ports. The British ships boasted steam power, advanced cannons, and iron hulls, advantages the Chinese Navy could not counter. The Qing forces, reliant on outdated weapons and decentralized command structures, were quickly overwhelmed. Despite its name, the war was not just about opium. It represented the culmination of tensions between China's efforts to maintain its Confucian social order and Britain's drive for global economic domination. But opium was the flashpoint, the most visible symbol of foreign interference. In 1842, the conflict ended with the signing of the Treaty of Nanking. It was a humiliating agreement for China. Not only did it cede the territory of Hong Kong to Britain, but it also opened 5 ports to foreign trade and granted British citizens extraterritorial rights, meaning they were subject to British law, not Chinese law, while in Chinese territory. The opium trade, while not explicitly legalized, continued largely unimpeded. The impact of this treaty and the war itself was profound. For China, it marked the beginning of what would later be called the Century of Humiliation, a period in which foreign powers repeatedly imposed their will on the country through military force and unequal treaties. The Chinese ruling class, long convinced of the superiority of their civilization, now faced the undeniable reality of Western dominance. Yet the Treaty of Nanking did not resolve the core issue, opium itself. British merchants continued to flood the Chinese market with the drug. Addiction worsened, spreading across all social classes, from impoverished labourers to wealthy scholars and bureaucrats. In many cities, opium dens became as common as tea houses. Some men smoked until their teeth fell out and their bodies withered. Families were ruined, debts mounted, productivity fell, entire regions suffered social and economic collapse. The Qing government tried repeatedly to ban opium. They issued edicts, increased enforcement, and arrested smugglers. But corruption within the bureaucracy, fueled by bribes from opium traffickers, made these efforts largely ineffective. Moreover, opium revenues had become essential to the British economy in Asia. The East India Company's entire operation in India was heavily subsidized by profits from opium exports to China. This grim cycle, addiction, prohibition, resistance, and foreign intervention, continued into the 1850s. The situation escalated once again with the Second Opium War, also known as the Arrow War, which broke out in 1856. This time, Britain was joined by France, and the justification for war was again thin. A dispute over the boarding of a British-registered ship and the alleged mistreatment of its crew by Chinese officials. But the real reasons, as before, lay deeper in Western frustration over China's resistance to full trade, liberalization, and political influence. The Second Opium War resulted in even greater concessions from China. The Treaty of Tientsin in 1858 and the Convention of Peking in 1860 legalized the opium trade, opened more ports, allowed Christian missionaries to operate freely, and permitted foreign embassies in Beijing. Western powers, including the United States and Russia, soon joined in the exploitation of China's weakened position. The country's sovereignty continued to erode, and its people bore the brunt of the humiliation. The damage from the Opium Wars extended far beyond economics and politics. Chinese society itself began to fracture. Confucian values, which emphasized social harmony, discipline, and moral virtue, were undermined by widespread addiction. The ruling Qing dynasty, already struggling with internal rebellions and fiscal crises, lost further credibility. One of the most catastrophic consequences was the Taiping Rebellion, a civil war that erupted in 1850 and lasted more than a decade. Though not directly caused by opium, the rebellion was fueled by the social disintegration and desperation that the opium epidemic helped to create. Led by Hong Xiuquan, a charismatic figure who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ, the rebellion sought to overthrow the Qing and establish a utopian Christian kingdom. The rebellion ultimately failed, but at a tremendous cost. It is estimated that between 20 and 30 million people died, making it one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Many historians consider the Taiping Rebellion to be inextricably linked to the chaos unleashed by the opium trade and foreign intervention. Meanwhile, opium was also shaping events far beyond China. In India, opium was being cultivated on an industrial scale under British supervision. Peasants in Bengal and Bihar were forced, sometimes violently, to grow poppies instead of food crops. This had devastating effects on rural economies and contributed to famines. The British government enforced a monopoly on production and maintained strict control over pricing and distribution. Opium revenue became a cornerstone of colonial finance. It paid for roads, railways, administrative buildings, and the British military presence in Asia. It's no exaggeration to say that the foundations of the British Empire in the East were built, at least in part, on opium profits. By the mid-19th century, opium had become a global commodity. It was traded on the open market, taxed by governments, transported by steamships, and consumed on every continent. And yet, despite its vast economic importance, it continued to destroy countless lives. Back in Europe and the United States, opium and its derivatives, such as morphine and later heroin, became increasingly popular in medical settings. Physicians praised its pain-relieving properties and prescribed it liberally for everything from menstrual cramps to toothaches. But addiction was poorly understood, and withdrawal symptoms were often mistaken for symptoms of the original illness. In the United States, opium dens began appearing in major cities like San Francisco and New York, often operated by Chinese immigrants who had arrived to work on railroads and in mines. These dens became associated with vice and criminality, sparking moral panic and xenophobic backlash. Anti-Chinese sentiment fused with fear of opium addiction, leading to some of the first drug laws in American history, laws that were as much about race as they were about health. As we move further into the 19th century, the tale of opium becomes even more tangled, touching every facet of life, from imperial policy to everyday suffering. It was no longer just a plant or even just a drug. It was a force, an invisible empire within empires, quietly changing the course of history. As the 19th century progressed, the world saw a dramatic transformation in the way opium was used, understood, and controlled. It had shifted from a sacred medicine to a globalized commercial drug. But the true pivot point came with the rise of industrial pharmacology, the introduction of refined opioids, and the growing medical community's embrace, followed by its alarm. In 1803, a German pharmacist named Friedrich Serturner isolated a potent alkaloid from opium. He named it morphine, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. Morphine was far more concentrated than raw opium and could be administered in precise doses, making it attractive to doctors. By the mid-19th century, morphine had revolutionized pain management in the Western world. Its popularity soared during the American Civil War. Battlefield surgeons relied on it heavily to treat wounded soldiers, leading to widespread addiction among veterans, an affliction often referred to as the soldier's disease. But at the time, morphine dependency wasn't clearly understood. It was seen less as a crisis and more as a necessary consequence of alleviating unbearable pain. This lack of understanding extended to the general population. Morphine was sold in pharmacies, often without prescription. It was included in syrups for coughs and colds, and even in tonics marketed to children. Opium derivatives were readily available and embedded in everyday life. Patent medicines advertised in newspapers promised miraculous cures, often failing to mention their highly addictive contents. The introduction of the hypodermic syringe in the 1850s further intensified morphine's impact. Now, for the first time, the drug could be injected directly into the bloodstream, providing almost immediate relief and a dangerously euphoric high. Many believed that injecting morphine was less likely to lead to addiction than taking it orally. This, of course, turned out to be tragically false. As morphine addiction rose, pharmaceutical companies looked for alternatives. In 1874, British chemist C.R. Alder Wright synthesized a new compound by boiling morphine with acetic anhydride. This created diacetylmorphine, a drug that would later be named heroin by the German pharmaceutical company Bayer. When Bayer introduced heroin to the market in 1898, it was promoted as a non-addictive substitute for morphine and a powerful cough suppressant. Ads proclaimed its safety and effectiveness, and doctors around the world embraced it. But within just a few years, reports of addiction and abuse emerged. Heroin, far from being a solution, proved to be even more addictive than morphine. Meanwhile, in Asia, the opium trade continued to flourish, particularly in colonial territories. In British-controlled Burma, Malaya, and parts of Southeast Asia, the colonial administrations directly oversaw the sale and taxation of opium. In many places, the government ran opium dens or issued licenses to private vendors. Revenues from opium made up a significant portion of colonial budgets. But resistance was growing. Reformers, missionaries, and some physicians began to push back against the opium trade, especially as its destructive social consequences became harder to ignore. In China, continued foreign control and opium addiction remained deeply unpopular, contributing to unrest that would eventually lead to the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1912. One of the most significant early efforts to address the global opium crisis came in the form of the Shanghai Opium Commission in 1909. It was the first international conference dedicated to controlling the drug trade, and it brought together representatives from 13 countries. Although it lacked enforcement power, it marked a turning point in how nations approached drug policy. In the United States, growing concerns over addiction, immigration, and public health led to the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914. This law, while framed as a tax regulation, effectively criminalized the non-medical use of opiates and cocaine. It also established a precedent for federal involvement in drug control, a foundation that would expand dramatically over the coming century. Simultaneously, a cultural shift was underway. What had once been seen as a miraculous remedy was now viewed with suspicion, even fear. Newspapers ran stories about dope fiends, often portraying addicts as dangerous or morally corrupt. This stigmatization, combined with racialized narratives, particularly against Chinese immigrants associated with opium smoking, fueled the push for prohibition. Yet despite the growing restrictions, the demand for opiates did not disappear. Instead, the drug trade went underground. In the early 20th century, black markets began to form in cities like New York, San Francisco, and Chicago. These networks were small at first, but as law enforcement cracked down, smuggling operations grew more sophisticated. Meanwhile, in China, the fall of the Qing dynasty did not end the opium problem. In fact, civil war and political instability allowed the opium economy to thrive. Warlords in various provinces funded their armies through poppy cultivation and opium sales. By the 1930s, estimates suggested that as many as 10 million Chinese were addicted to opium. The nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek made efforts to eradicate opium, launching mass campaigns to destroy poppy fields and rehabilitate addicts. These programs were only partially effective. In some cases, local officials profited from the trade themselves. In others, eradication efforts targeted poor farmers while leaving wealthy traffickers untouched. Japan's invasion of China in the 1930s further complicated matters. The Japanese military used opium as a tool of control, particularly in occupied territories like Manchuria. Puppet governments supported by the Japanese ran state-controlled opium monopolies, which generated revenue and kept the local population subdued. At the same time, Western nations were developing stronger international drug control frameworks. The League of Nations, and later the United Nations, created commissions and conventions aimed at regulating the production, distribution, and use of opiates. The most important of these was the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, signed in 1961, which consolidated previous agreements and set global standards for narcotics control. But enforcement remained uneven. In many parts of the world, opium was still grown in large quantities, often in remote regions beyond the reach of state authority. Farmers in Afghanistan, the Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia, and parts of Pakistan continued to cultivate poppies driven by poverty, tradition, and the lure of the international black market. Back in the West, medical attitudes toward opiates evolved once again. By the mid-20th century, heroin had been made illegal in most countries. Morphine, while still used in hospitals, was tightly regulated, and a new generation of synthetic opioids like methadone and oxycodone was being developed, offering powerful pain relief with the hope of reduced addiction potential. This hope, as history would soon reveal, was tragically misplaced. By the 1950s and 60s, the conversation around opium and its derivatives began to shift again, this time shaped by the twin pressures of scientific advancement and political transformation. A new era of synthetic opioid production was emerging, marked not by poppy fields in Asia, but by pharmaceutical laboratories in the United States and Europe. One of the most consequential developments was the rise of methadone, first synthesized in Germany in the 1930s under the name dolafine. After World War II, American researchers began studying methadone as an alternative to morphine for chronic pain. It proved effective, but also highly addictive. Nevertheless, it became an important tool in the treatment of heroin addiction, used to manage withdrawal symptoms and reduce cravings. Methadone maintenance therapy would later become a cornerstone of modern addiction medicine. Alongside methadone, pharmaceutical companies began producing drugs like oxycodone, hydrocodone, and pethidine, also known as meperidine. These medications were marketed heavily to doctors, especially as effective treatments for post-operative pain, cancer, and other serious conditions. For a time, they were seen as wonder drugs, precise, manageable, and transformative. Yet despite these medical advances, global opium production never truly slowed. In rural Afghanistan, poppy cultivation had become a way of life. Entire families and villages depended on the crop for survival. The same was true in parts of Myanmar and Laos. While governments in these regions signed agreements to limit production, enforcement was inconsistent. In some cases, corrupt officials turned a blind eye or actively profited from the trade. International drug control efforts also became entangled with Cold War politics. The United States, concerned about the spread of communism, often supported regimes and militias in Southeast Asia that were deeply involved in the drug trade. In some instances, the CIA was accused of turning a blind eye to heroin trafficking in exchange for intelligence or strategic cooperation. Meanwhile, in the US, the seeds of a new epidemic were being sown, not by traditional opium, but by its synthetic cousins. By the 1980s and 90s, pharmaceutical companies began a massive campaign to expand the use of prescription opioids. Chief among these companies was Purdue Pharma, which introduced OxyContin in 1996. Marketed as a safe, time-released form of oxycodone, OxyContin was aggressively promoted to doctors and patients. Purdue claimed that the risk of addiction was minimal, often citing a single paragraph from a decades-old letter to the editor in a medical journal as evidence. Sales soared. Doctors, trusting the claims, prescribed opioids for everything from back pain to minor surgeries. But patients quickly discovered that crushing or chewing the pills bypassed the time-release mechanism, delivering a powerful and immediate high. Abuse spread rapidly, particularly in economically depressed regions like Appalachia and the Rust Belt, where chronic pain was common and access to healthcare limited. Addiction rates spiked. Emergency rooms filled with overdose victims. Entire communities were devastated. And when prescriptions became harder to obtain, due to tighter regulations and shifting public opinion, many turned to street drugs. Heroin, often cheaper and more potent, surged in popularity once again. This crisis evolved further in the 2010s with the arrival of fentanyl, a synthetic opioid many times more powerful than heroin. Initially used in hospital settings for severe pain, fentanyl began appearing on the black market, often mixed with heroin or counterfeit pills. Its potency made it easy to transport in small quantities, but also extremely lethal. Tiny miscalculations in dosage led to instant overdoses. Today, fentanyl is a leading cause of overdose deaths in the United States and several other countries. Its emergence marks the latest chapter in a tragic saga that began thousands of years ago with the cultivation of the opium poppy. Despite our advanced science, international laws, and public awareness, the world remains entangled in the same fundamental dilemma: how to balance the extraordinary pain-relieving power of opioids with their equally extraordinary capacity for destruction. And so, the story of opium continues, not as a relic of ancient history, but as a pressing issue of global health, ethics, and human suffering. To understand how deeply opium has affected the world, we must look beyond medicine and addiction and into the very foundations of modern geopolitics. For centuries, opium was not merely a drug. It was a currency of power, a tool of empire, and a cause of revolution. Its influence has been so pervasive that one can trace major turning points in global history directly to its rise and spread. Let's begin with British India, where the British East India Company consolidated power during the 18th and early 19th centuries. India became not only a jewel in the British crown, but also the heart of its opium enterprise. The fertile plains of Bihar and Bengal were particularly well suited for poppy cultivation, and the colonial government imposed strict controls to ensure that opium production remained profitable and monopolized. Indian farmers were coerced into growing poppies instead of food crops. The system was simple but brutal. Farmers received advances from the government that they were required to repay in opium. If they failed to meet quotas or resisted cultivation, they could lose their land or face severe penalties. As a result, the countryside became dotted with poppy fields, and local economies were hollowed out by dependence on a non-nutritive, export-oriented crop. This opium wasn't consumed locally. It was destined almost entirely for China. The British East India Company would auction the opium to private merchants, who then smuggled it into China through ports like Canton. The profits from these sales were immense and helped fund Britain's growing empire. What made this system so devastating was its self-reinforcing nature. Britain purchased massive quantities of tea, silk, and porcelain from China, commodities that were in high demand among Europeans. But China didn't want Western goods in return. It wanted silver. As a result, Britain was running a significant trade deficit with China. Opium changed that. By selling Indian opium in China, Britain reversed the flow of silver, draining China's economy and balancing the books on their own end. In effect, millions of Chinese became addicted to a drug that had been systematically cultivated by a colonial government to fund imperial expansion. This wasn't simply trade, it was weaponized commerce. This system became so entrenched that by the 1830s, over 30,000 chests of opium, each weighing about 140 pounds, were being smuggled into China annually. The trade corrupted Chinese officials, undermined public health, and created a shadow economy outside the control of the Qing dynasty. As mentioned in earlier parts, China's attempt to suppress this trade led directly to the Opium Wars, but the ripple effects did not stop with China's defeat. Britain's victory in the First Opium War made it clear that the rules of global trade were now dictated by industrialized Western powers. It also opened the door for other imperialist ventures across Asia. France, Germany, Russia, and even Japan would all seek spheres of influence within China. They forced similar treaties on the Qing, secured port access, and in many cases, benefited from the continuation of the opium economy. What had started as a bilateral trade dispute had now grown into a global struggle for access, dominance, and influence. Meanwhile, in the United States, opium was shaping both foreign and domestic policies. American merchants had participated in the China trade for decades, often running their own opium operations alongside the British. Prominent families, like the Astors, made fortunes off the drug. The money helped finance railroads, banks, and early American industrial expansion. Domestically, America's first major drug policies were heavily influenced by the cultural perception of opium. In the mid to late 19th century, opium dens operated openly in cities like San Francisco. These establishments were often run by Chinese immigrants and catered to both Chinese and white clientele. But as anti-Chinese sentiment grew, fueled by economic competition, racism, and fear, so too did opposition to opium. Laws targeting opium smoking emerged in the 1870s and 1880s, not out of concern for public health, but out of a desire to police and marginalize immigrant communities. These early drug laws were often enforced unevenly. Smoking opium was criminalized, a practice associated with Chinese immigrants, while medicinal use of opium by white Americans remained largely tolerated. Thus, from the beginning, drug policy in the West was inseparable from issues of race, class, and power. Opium was not just a health issue, it was a social issue and a political one. It became a tool for enforcing moral boundaries, drawing lines between acceptable and unacceptable behavior, and justifying systemic inequality. Back in China, the devastation wrought by opium persisted into the 20th century. Even after the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912, opium remained a central concern. The fledgling Republic of China launched a series of anti-opium campaigns. Some of these efforts were sincere and partially successful. Opium dens were closed, addicts were treated, and public education campaigns were launched. But the problem was deeply entrenched. Local warlords continued to profit from the drug trade. In some provinces, poppy cultivation was not only tolerated, but taxed, with revenues funding private armies and regional governments. These warlords operated with near total autonomy, and their reliance on opium made it almost impossible to stamp out the practice without full-scale military campaigns. Things became even more complicated with the rise of the Communist Party under Mao Zedong. When Mao's forces eventually took power in 1949, they made the eradication of opium one of their top priorities. In one of the most aggressive anti-drug campaigns in history, the new government executed thousands of traffickers, destroyed millions of acres of poppy fields, and sent addicts to forced rehabilitation centers. Within a decade, opium was virtually eliminated from mainland China. While the methods were authoritarian and often brutal, they were undeniably effective in the short term. It was one of the rare instances in world history where a state largely succeeded in wiping out an entrenched narcotic trade, though at great human and moral cost. In the 20th century, the opium trade shifted once again, this time to regions less directly controlled by governments. The Golden Triangle, the border region where Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand meet, became the world's primary supplier of illicit opium. Rugged terrain, weak governance, and political conflict made the area ideal for drug production and trafficking. Ethnic militias, insurgent groups, and even elements of national armies became involved in the trade. Some used opium to finance independence movements. Others were simply seeking profit. International narcotics syndicates soon formed to move the product through Southeast Asia into international ports, and eventually into Europe and North America. The Golden Crescent, comprising Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran, also became a major hub. Afghan poppy cultivation surged, especially during periods of conflict when the central government had little control over rural areas. After the Soviet invasion in 1979, and later during the US-led war beginning in 2001, opium production exploded. Afghanistan became the world's largest supplier of illicit opium, accounting for over 90% of global production at certain points. What's striking about these developments is how consistent the story remains. Wherever there is instability, poverty, and weak governance, the opium economy finds fertile ground. It offers quick money in places where few alternatives exist. It thrives in shadows, often aided or ignored by those in power. And it leaves behind a trail of corruption, violence, and human suffering. As we trace the journey of opium from ancient Sumer to the mountains of Afghanistan, we begin to see a chilling pattern. Opium is not simply a drug, it is a mirror. It reflects the values, priorities, and contradictions of the societies that interact with it. It reveals the boundaries between medicine and profit, between healing and harm, between control and chaos. And as we move closer to the present day, those boundaries continue to blur. By the early 2020s, the world found itself in the midst of a full-blown crisis. One that had been building slowly, layer by layer, over centuries. What had begun with a poppy in Mesopotamia, nurtured in the medical scrolls of ancient Egypt, magnified by imperial ambition, and later dressed in the white coat of modern pharmacology, was now claiming lives on a scale that eclipsed many modern wars. The opioid epidemic had become not just a national emergency in the United States, but a global concern. Overdose deaths were rising in Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and parts of Europe, particularly in countries with aging populations and overburdened health systems. But in the US, the numbers were staggering. In some counties, life expectancy began to decline, not because of cancer, heart disease, or war, but because of opioids. Public awareness of the crisis had grown rapidly. Media outlets reported on families losing multiple generations to addiction. Documentaries exposed how drug companies had manipulated data and downplayed risks. Whistleblowers testified before Congress. Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin, became a household name, symbolizing the corporate greed many believed had fueled the epidemic. In 2019, Purdue filed for bankruptcy and later agreed to a multi-billion-dollar settlement. The Sackler family, who had owned Purdue, faced widespread criticism and public backlash. Museums and institutions began removing the family's name from donor plaques. Still, for many, no financial settlement could ever compensate for the loss of life. Amid this reckoning, the conversation around addiction began to shift, slowly but meaningfully. Addiction was increasingly recognized as a disease, not a character flaw. More doctors were trained in pain management and addiction medicine. Harm reduction strategies, once controversial, gained mainstream acceptance. These included naloxone distribution, making overdose reversing medication widely available in schools, homes, and public places. Needle exchange programs, designed to reduce the spread of infectious diseases like HIV and hepatitis C. Supervised injection sites, facilities where users could take drugs under medical supervision to prevent overdose deaths. Medication-assisted treatment, MAT, using drugs like methadone, buprenorphine, or naltrexone to help manage addiction and prevent relapse. At the same time, a wave of lawsuits and policy changes aimed to hold those responsible to account. Dozens of state and local governments sued pharmaceutical companies, distributors, and even pharmacy chains like Walgreens and CVS. Billions of dollars in settlement funds were allocated for treatment centers, education programs, and recovery initiatives. Yet, even as the legal tide turned, the human cost continued to rise. Fentanyl analogues, produced in illegal labs primarily in China and trafficked through Mexico, began flooding markets. These analogues, slightly altered chemical versions of fentanyl, were designed to evade regulation while maintaining deadly potency. In many overdose cases, users had no idea they were ingesting fentanyl at all. The speed of this synthetic wave was unlike anything seen before. In traditional heroin production, there were crops to harvest, transport routes to secure, and cartels to organize. But synthetic opioids could be made in a lab, smuggled in tiny quantities, and sold cheaply. It was a paradigm shift, akin to going from mail-order catalogs to instant digital downloads. In response, governments began to rethink their approach. Portugal, for instance, became a model for progressive drug policy. In 2001, Portugal decriminalized all drugs for personal use and focused on treatment over punishment. The results were dramatic. Addiction rates fell, overdoses declined, and HIV infections plummeted. The Portuguese model was now studied around the world as a potential solution to the long-standing failures of the punitive approach. In contrast, some countries maintained hardline policies. In Southeast Asia, possession of small amounts of opiates could still result in long prison terms, or even execution. The global landscape of drug law was, and remains, deeply fractured. In some regions, addiction is treated as a public health issue. In others, it is treated as a criminal offense. This inconsistency often leads to confusion, stigma, and, tragically, preventable deaths. One of the most overlooked aspects of the crisis is the psychological toll. Opioids are, above all, a response to pain, both physical and emotional. In the modern era, many users begin their journey with a legitimate prescription, a back injury, a dental surgery, a chronic illness. But for many, especially in communities hollowed out by economic decline, opioids became a way to dull something deeper. Loneliness, trauma, anxiety, despair. In interviews and research studies, users often describe a longing for something peaceful, something warm, something that made them feel whole, if only briefly. In this way, opioids were not just chemical agents, they were emotional sedatives. And this truth speaks to the larger human condition, our endless search for comfort, for relief, for escape. The ancient Sumerians called opium the joy plant. But joy, as it turns out, is complicated. In the midst of crisis, however, there have also been glimmers of innovation and resilience. New approaches to treatment, including psychedelic-assisted therapy, trauma-informed care, and community-based recovery networks, have shown promise. Cities like Vancouver and New York began experimenting with safe supply initiatives, offering medical-grade alternatives to street drugs to prevent fatal overdoses. The COVID-19 pandemic, paradoxically, accelerated some of these reforms. With lockdowns limiting access to treatment and increasing isolation, opioid deaths surged in 2020 and 2021. But the crisis also forced governments to ease regulations, expand telemedicine, and adopt more flexible harm reduction policies. Some of these changes, once thought impossible, are now permanent. And so, here we are, over 5,000 years since opium was first cultivated, still wrestling with the same questions. How do we manage pain without creating dependence? How do we honor the power of a drug without falling under its spell? How do we build systems that protect people rather than punish them? These questions don't have simple answers, but understanding the history, the full, global, messy, painful history, can help us ask better ones. Because this is not just the story of a drug, it's the story of humanity itself. The long, tangled history of opium is a mirror, not just of empires and economies, but of how we, as human beings, confront pain, power, and vulnerability. To look at the modern world through the lens of opium is to recognize how deep its influence runs. From the most advanced hospitals to the most marginalized communities, its presence can still be felt. As we explore further into the 21st century, we must ask, what now? What does the future hold for opium and its synthetic descendants? And how are nations, societies, and individuals learning from the past to shape a healthier, more just future? Let us begin with public policy, which has entered an era of reflection and reform. After decades of the war on drugs, with its focus on punishment, surveillance, and incarceration, many policymakers have begun to acknowledge the unintended consequences of these strategies. Across the United States, dozens of states have passed laws aimed at expanding access to addiction treatment. Naloxone, the overdose-reversing drug, is now stocked in schools, airports, libraries, and homes. Some cities have launched opioid courts, where non-violent offenders are diverted into treatment programs instead of prisons. In Canada, cities like Vancouver have embraced harm reduction as a cornerstone of public health. Supervised injection sites, controversial at first, have been shown to dramatically reduce overdose deaths, prevent disease transmission, and connect users to services. Mobile outreach teams now offer clean supplies, support, and even primary care to people living on the streets. Meanwhile, Europe continues to experiment with innovative approaches. In Switzerland, heroin-assisted treatment has helped stabilize the lives of long-term users who have not responded to traditional methods. Participants receive measured doses under medical supervision, allowing them to regain structure, find employment, and avoid street drugs. Portugal's model of decriminalization remains a global example of policy success, though often misunderstood as legalization. Portugal's approach is more nuanced. Possession of small amounts for personal use is treated as a public health matter, not a criminal one. Addicts are offered treatment, not jail time. The result? Lower addiction rates, fewer overdoses, and a decline in HIV transmission. Despite these successes, challenges remain immense. One of the most difficult is the emergence of synthetic opioids on the global black market. Fentanyl is not just stronger than heroin, it's also easier to produce and distribute. A suitcase full of fentanyl can contain thousands of fatal doses. This has made interdiction incredibly difficult. Even small production operations can fuel entire distribution networks. Traffickers have also learned how to manipulate chemical formulas to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. By making slight changes to the molecular structure of fentanyl, they create new analogues that are technically legal until they are banned. This game of cat and mouse between chemistry and regulation has kept authorities struggling to keep pace. Another major concern is the globalization of addiction. As pharmaceutical markets expand into developing countries, there is growing fear that the same opioid marketing strategies that devastated the US could take root elsewhere. In India, Brazil, and parts of Africa, reports have already emerged of overprescription and dependency. Companies that once dominated US sales are now setting their sights abroad. And without strong regulatory frameworks, these nations could become the next front lines in the opioid epidemic. The very same tactics, understating risks, promoting aggressive treatment of pain, and minimizing addiction concerns, are being recycled in new languages, in new markets. This reality has sparked an international movement for accountability and oversight. Global health organizations, like the World Health Organization, WHO, and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, are working to create consistent, science-based policies that balance pain relief with public safety. Their message is clear. Access to opioids is important, but unchecked access can be catastrophic. Beyond policy and medicine, there's also a cultural shift happening, a change in how society talks about addiction. For years, addicts were portrayed as criminals, as failures, as people to fear. Today, more stories are being told from the inside. Documentaries, memoirs, podcasts, and films have begun to humanize the experience of addiction. Former users speak openly about their struggles. Parents share the grief of loss. Doctors and nurses describe their own learning curves. This changing narrative matters. Shame and stigma are often what keep people from seeking help. But when addiction is framed as a disease and recovery as a journey, more people find the strength to reach out. Communities become more supportive. Policy becomes more compassionate. Technology has also entered the picture. Telemedicine has made it easier than ever to access addiction treatment, especially in rural areas where services were once non-existent. Online platforms now connect patients with counselors, doctors, and support groups. Apps track cravings, offer daily encouragement, and even help manage withdrawal symptoms. For many, a smartphone has become a lifeline. And yet, amidst all this progress, we must not forget the root causes. Addiction does not exist in a vacuum. It grows in soil made of trauma, poverty, isolation, and despair. It flourishes where people feel powerless, unsupported, unseen. If we truly want to reduce opioid dependency, we must address the deeper issues: inequality, unemployment, mental illness, and broken healthcare systems. In many ways, the opioid crisis is not just a drug problem. It's a reflection of societal failure. But there is hope. Around the world, grassroots organizations, local leaders, and recovered individuals are building a new model of care, one based on dignity, patience, and connection. They understand what centuries of empire, medicine, and law often ignored: that healing is personal, that people are more than their addictions, that recovery is not linear, and that every life touched by opioids is worth fighting for. And so, as the story of opium enters its next chapter, it carries with it a powerful lesson, not just about a plant or a pill, but about human nature, our capacity for innovation and for destruction, our hunger for relief and our tendency to overreach, our endless search for balance between pain and peace. Opium has shaped civilizations. It has built empires and broken families. It has been used to wage war and to bring comfort. And in its long, complex journey, it continues to ask us the same essential question: how do we face our pain without losing ourselves in the process? At this point in our journey through the history of opium, we must pause, not just to recount more facts or policies, but to reflect. Because behind every war, every prescription, every overdose statistic, and every poppy field, there are people. Millions of people. Some searching for relief, some searching for escape, others pulled into a storm they never saw coming. And when we pull back the curtain on the centuries-long saga of opium, what we find is not just a drug. We find an idea, an ancient seductive promise that pain can be soothed, that sorrow can be softened, that suffering can be silenced. To understand why opium has held such enduring power over human beings, we must look inward, into the nature of pain, into the vulnerabilities that make us reach for relief, and into the long, complicated relationship humanity has always had with altered consciousness. Pain, both physical and emotional, is one of the few universal experiences. It transcends race, language, religion, and geography. It can arrive suddenly or linger for decades. And yet, for most of human history, we had few tools to treat it. Broken bones, childbirth, illness, grief, all endured with limited help. That's why, When opium arrived on the stage of civilization, it was revered. Here was a substance that could dull pain, slow the breath, soothe anxiety, and bring sleep. For ancient healers, it was divine, a gift from the gods, a way to ease human suffering, if only for a time. But opium did more than dull pain. It changed perception. It turned down the volume of the world. It created space between a person and their burdens. In the right doses, it could evoke dreams, visions, a sense of weightlessness. To many, this was not just relief. It was transcendence. This is the deeper reason why opium and its derivatives have never gone away. They speak to something ancient in us, the longing to escape suffering, not just from physical wounds, but from the ache of existence itself, from loneliness, loss, failure, shame, fear, and despair. Philosophers have long wrestled with this idea. In his famous work, The Birth of Tragedy, Friedrich Nietzsche describes two opposing forces in art and life: the Apollonian, rational, orderly, clear, and the Dionysian, chaotic, emotional, intoxicating. Opium belongs squarely to the latter. It is the Dionysian elixir. It dissolves boundaries, erases the sharp edges of life, and offers a temporary retreat into oblivion. But that retreat comes with a cost. The very qualities that make opium powerful are the same ones that make it dangerous. It works so well, too well. It trains the brain to associate the absence of pain with the presence of the drug. Over time, the natural ability to regulate pain, emotion, and stress is eroded. The user becomes dependent, not just physically, but existentially. Life without the drug feels intolerable. Joy becomes impossible. Purpose evaporates. And so begins the cycle. Use, relief, dependence, withdrawal, use again. It is a loop that spans continents, cultures, and classes. It has claimed emperors and peasants, artists and soldiers, doctors and patients. And despite all our modern knowledge, it continues to ensnare millions. Why? Part of the answer lies in how modern society treats pain, not just physical, but emotional. In many cultures, pain is something to be hidden, managed privately, even denied. We are told to be strong, to push through, to get over it. Mental illness is often stigmatized. Grief is hurried. Vulnerability is shamed. And into that silence, opioids enter like a whisper. Take this. You won't have to feel it anymore. But the truth is, pain serves a purpose. It alerts us to injury. It tells us when something is wrong. And perhaps most importantly, it connects us. Shared suffering creates empathy. Communities are built around collective healing. Rituals, religions, and relationships are often born from the need to comfort one another through pain. Opium short-circuits that process. It offers a shortcut, a chemical bridge over troubled waters, but the bridge is unstable and often leads back to deeper waters still. And yet, it's too simplistic to condemn opium entirely. To do so would ignore the countless lives it has saved in hospital rooms, hospice care, and trauma centers. For people living with chronic pain, opioids are not a luxury, they are a necessity. For palliative care patients, they offer dignity in dying. For surgeons, they are critical tools. This paradox, that opioids are both poison and medicine, is at the heart of the global struggle. There is no single solution, because there is no single problem. The same molecule that brings peace to the dying can bring ruin to the living. The same poppy that eased ancient childbirth now fuels modern epidemics. The key lies in context, compassion, and complexity. We must understand that addiction is not simply a matter of choice. It is a disease of the brain, shaped by environment, genetics, trauma, and opportunity. Recovery is possible, but it is rarely linear. It requires time, support, and forgiveness. We must also understand that pain is not the enemy. Unrelieved pain is cruel, but the erasure of all discomfort is not the goal. The goal is resilience. To help people live with their pain, not be destroyed by it. To offer tools, not just pills, community, not just chemicals. And we must recognize that behind the headlines, behind the court cases and crisis numbers, there are real stories. A mother who injured her back and became addicted after surgery. A teenager who took a pill at a party and never woke up. A veteran who lost his way after returning from war. A doctor who wrote prescriptions too easily, then watched patients suffer. Each story matters. Each life is a thread in the larger tapestry of the opioid narrative. And when we take time to listen, to really listen, we begin to see the fuller picture. Opium has always been more than a drug. It is a mirror of our desires, our fears, our values. It shows us where we hurt and how we heal. It shows us what we avoid and what we embrace. And perhaps most of all, it shows us what we are willing to trade for comfort. Will we trade awareness for sedation, truth for numbness, life for a temporary escape? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones. Because the opioid crisis is not just about medicine, it is about meaning. And if there is any lesson to take from thousands of years of history, it is this. We cannot banish suffering, but we can choose how we respond to it. With compassion, with honesty, with care, and with the wisdom to know that some bridges, no matter how tempting, may not lead us where we hope to go. As we near the end of our exploration into the world of opium, its history and its consequences, we arrive at a place of reflection, a quiet valley in the narrative where the voices of the past, present and future all seem to echo at once. Opium is no longer just a plant grown in remote fields. It is now embedded in our laws, our medical systems, our memories, and our losses. The poppy has become a symbol of medicine, of addiction, of empire, of grief, of both salvation and suffering. In many ways, the story of opium is the story of civilization's evolving relationship with power. The power to relieve, to dominate, to exploit, to forget. Let us now turn our focus to how opium has changed institutions, particularly in the realms of medicine, law, science, and culture. The medical establishment, perhaps more than any other institution, has been forced to confront the duality of opioids. For decades, the primary goal of medicine was to eliminate pain. Doctors were taught to ask patients to rate their pain on a scale of 1 to 10. Pain became a fifth vital sign, and with it came a new pressure to prescribe, to intervene, to provide relief quickly and completely. But in this pursuit of painlessness, a critical element was lost. The understanding that pain is not always something to be erased, but something to be managed and understood. By focusing so heavily on pharmaceutical solutions, the medical field often overlooked other modalities: physical therapy, psychological support, mindfulness, nutrition, and social connection. Now, with hindsight sharpened by crisis, there's a growing recognition that chronic pain is complex. It's not just a symptom, it's an experience shaped by biology, environment, trauma, and emotion. And managing it requires more than a prescription. It requires listening, patience, and multidisciplinary care. In law and policy, opium has left an indelible mark. The drive to control opium and its derivatives led to some of the most influential drug policies of the modern era. Policies that have shaped societies and
lives across generations. From the Harrison Narcotics Act in the United States in 1914 to the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 to the United Nations International Drug Treaties, the legacy of opium control is vast. These laws created entire bureaucracies, from the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, to narcotics task forces in almost every major nation. But with these structures came consequences, particularly for marginalized communities. The enforcement of drug laws, especially in the United States, has been deeply unequal. People of color, despite similar rates of drug use, have been arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned at much higher rates than their white counterparts. Families were torn apart. Neighborhoods were destabilized, and entire generations were lost to cycles of incarceration. This legacy is now being re-examined. In recent years, many jurisdictions have moved toward decriminalization, record expungement, and restorative justice. The aim is not only to correct policy mistakes, but to acknowledge the harm done by decades of punitive enforcement. Meanwhile, in the realm of science, the opioid crisis has spurred remarkable innovation. Researchers are working on developing non-addictive painkillers, using technologies like CRISPR, artificial intelligence, and novel molecular pathways. The goal is to create relief without risk, drugs that can help without harming. At the same time, scientists are learning more about the neurobiology of addiction than ever before. We now understand that addiction is a chronic brain disease that affects the reward, motivation, memory, and control circuits. This understanding is reshaping everything from treatment to prevention. Addiction, once seen as a failure of willpower, is now understood as a condition that requires comprehensive, compassionate care, just like diabetes or heart disease. Finally, we arrive at the realm of culture. Opium's fingerprints are all over literature, music, and art, from the hazy writings of Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Thomas de Quincey to the haunting lyrics of 20th century musicians. Opioids have long served as both muse and menace. They represent not just escapism, but an altered way of seeing the world. Art often reflects our most intimate struggles, and it is no surprise that the tension between pain and pleasure, suffering and relief, has inspired some of our most poignant works. In these stories, we see the full spectrum of the human experience, from triumph to tragedy, from brilliance to collapse. But in recent years, new voices have emerged. Voices of recovery, of families rebuilding, of communities choosing to rise rather than retreat. These stories, too, are worthy of being told. They remind us that while opium has caused great harm, the human spirit continues to seek light, even in the darkest corners. As we stand at the edge of this long history, we're left with a profound understanding. Opium changed the world, not because it is evil, but because it is powerful. And like all powerful things, it demands respect, understanding, and humility. It teaches us that relief and destruction can come from the same source, that comfort and dependence are separated by a fragile line, that medicine and poison are often two sides of the same coin. As we bring this long and winding journey to a close, let us not simply mark the end of a narrative. Let us pause deeply and take a breath with the full weight of what has been uncovered. We began thousands of years ago in the cradle of civilization, where Sumerian scribes first called the poppy the joy plant. From that ancient time to today's modern world, opium has been a constant companion, changing names, changing forms, shifting places, but never truly disappearing. It has survived empires, crossed oceans, fueled industries, and altered destinies. Few substances in human history have exerted such far-reaching influence. Opium and its derivatives, morphine, heroin, oxycodone, fentanyl, have shaped how we experience pain and how we respond to suffering. They have also revealed our most difficult truths about power, about greed, about compassion, and about what it means to be vulnerable. And in reflecting on this story, one cannot help but see the full spectrum of human nature, its contradictions and complexities. On one hand, opium has been a gift. It has eased the pain of childbirth. It has brought comfort to the dying. It has allowed surgeries that would otherwise be unthinkable. It has quieted the agony of soldiers and soothed the nerves of patients in unbearable states of distress. It has prolonged life, preserved dignity, and calmed the mind when no other remedy could. On the other hand, it has ruined families, leveled communities, and left millions dead. It has funded cartels, wars, and corruption. It has turned hope into dependency and healing into devastation. It has led people to crime, despair, and early graves. It has exploited the weak and enabled the powerful. It has turned medicine into marketing and compassion into profit. This duality is what makes opium not just a historical artifact, but a moral question. Because behind every use of an opioid, legal or illegal, prescribed or purchased, is a person trying to feel better, a person trying to silence pain, a person reaching for something, relief, clarity, peace, sleep, or perhaps just a few hours without the weight of the world. And if that person's reach ends in ruin, whose fault is it? The drug, the dealer, the doctor, the system? Or is it a collective responsibility, shared by all of us in how we treat pain, how we care for the vulnerable, and how we structure a society where so many feel the need to escape? As we look forward into the decades ahead, the question is not whether opioids will remain part of human life. They will. The question is, how will we choose to live with them? We have learned that prohibition alone does not work. Neither does unrestricted access. We have seen that shame silences those who need help, and punishment only deepens wounds. We have learned that addiction is not weakness, but suffering. That users are not criminals, but people. That healing is not linear, but possible. We now stand at a moment in history where the world has the opportunity to change course, not just with better laws or more research, but with a renewed commitment to compassion. This means listening to those who have struggled with addiction, not as cautionary tales, but as sources of wisdom. It means supporting harm reduction, not because it's easy, but because it saves lives. It means investing in mental health, in community, in connection. And most importantly, it means recognizing that the true antidote to addiction is not just a medication. It is belonging. It is purpose.
It is hope. Opium has taught us much about our capacity for innovation, exploitation, and healing. It has tested our values and challenged our institutions. It has revealed cracks in our systems and resilience in our people. And while we cannot undo the past, we can honor it. We can learn from it, and we can build a future where the mistakes of history are not repeated, but remembered, and where suffering is not hidden, but met with courage and care. So tonight, as you rest, allow this story to settle not only in your mind, but in your heart. Think of the fields of ancient poppies swaying in the wind. Think of the hands that harvested them, hoping to heal or to survive. Think of the lives saved, the lives lost, and the long thread that connects them. And know that in the story of opium, we see ourselves, not only in our pain, but in our enduring search for relief, for understanding, and for peace. Good night.